This is Hidden Roll, the podcast where we introduce you to the brains behind your favorite toys, games, and all things play. Before today's episode with Scott Rogers, we need to talk about some changes coming to the podcast. I'm going to drop the radio voice for a moment. We need your help. We make this podcast at our cost because we love sharing the stories behind the industry of play and its incredible community. But in order to offset the time and expense of editing and publishing these episodes, we really need to start growing our audience. We have a plan. We want to reach 1,000 subscribers on YouTube by the end of summer. And to do that, we need your help. If you are listening to this episode on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other platform and you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell so that you can be notified every time we post a new episode. We've got great new content that we're going to be posting every Wednesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Time. So subscribe to our YouTube channel, Hidden Roll Podcast, thumbs up our videos, leave a comment or two, and tell your friends and family to subscribe so that we can continue sharing stories about the brains behind all things play. With that out of the way, we'd also like to give special thanks to our old friends at POP, peopleofplay.com, the one-stop hub for all toy and game inventors. Without them, this podcast would not be possible.
You're listening to Hidden Roll, the podcast that introduces you to the brains behind your favorite toys, games, and all things play. I'm inventor, artist, and engineer, David Yakos.
And I'm game designer, Branson Faustini. And together, we get to interview the people who make the world of fun.
And because fun is the most important thing in our life, today's guest is a former Imagineer who helped create interactive experiences in Disney theme parks. He's been a game developer and designer for over 30 years. He's authored books on game design, including Level Up, Swipe This, and a new book, Your Turn. And he's also developed games that you will know and love, things like the Pantone game and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the game. Scott Rogers, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me, guys.
No, I'm excited to dive into this. You've got, you seem to me like one of those guys that really could do anything, and you've done a lot of different things. And I'm curious, was it your plan to get into the world of play? How did you, was that like growing up, like, I want to be a game developer? Like, how did you get into this business?
You know, the irony is I did, but I never thought it was possible. As a really young kid, I had read about jobs like Imagineering or toy inventors or things like that. Like I knew who Marvin Glass was at a pretty young age, but I didn't think it was a viable job and one that I could have. And so instead, I grew up in San Diego. And so I was always drawn to comic books. And I would go to San Diego Comic-Con every year. I've been to almost every show since 1976 or 7, with a few years I've missed off. But anyway, so I thought I would draw comic books. I ended up talking to a lot of professionals, guys like John Romita and Jack Kirby and Carl Barks, and they all told me how horrible it was to be a comic book artist. So I was like, all right, well, I guess I won't be that. So then I, like most of us, I saw Star Wars and it blew my mind and changed my life. And so then I was like, well, maybe I'll get into doing films. And I thought maybe I would work as a storyboard artist or concept artist or something like that. And so I decided college, I was going to go to art school. But I talked to the two fellas who were running the portfolio review, and they said, well, you might want to get your general education done first. And I said, oh, well, where did you go for your general education? They said, one guy was like, I went to Cal State Long Beach. And the other guy goes, oh, hey, I went to Cal State Long Beach too. And so I said, I guess I'm applying to Cal State Long Beach. So I applied to Cal State Long Beach. I got in, ended up getting 2 degrees, one in art and one in filmmaking. 2 degrees that I later found out you don't really need to have to work in either industry. But I'm proud that I have those. I've earned those. And then I started to work in film and animation, but that was my film industry career was cut short by an act of God. I was supposed to do an internship with Spielberg with Amblin, and a tropical storm wiped out all the sets for Jurassic Park. And that all the money for my internship went to rebuilding the sets. So my film industry career was cut short. And so I was literally sitting in a coffee shop drawing in a sketchbook And a friend of mine came up to me and said, "Hey, do you know how to draw, Scott?" I said, "Yes, I'm drawing right now." And he said, "We're looking for artists for video games." He says, "You know how to draw on a computer?" And I had drawn with Photoshop and things like that. My brother had a Mac, so I was used to drawing on Mac Paint. Essentially, one thing led to another. And I ended up working as an artist in video games. Did that for a couple of years. And one day I was looking over the wall of my cubicle, and the game designers were yucking it up, and they were having way more fun making games than I was. The art in 16-bit days was kind of like laying bathroom tile. It was like, you're very meticulously putting dots to make, characters. And it didn't feel like art. It felt like busy work. And so I'm like, those guys are having way more fun making games than I am. And this seems more in tune with what I've studied and learned and enjoyed over my youth. I'm going to go over there and say, how do I become a game designer? And fortunately, there was a fellow there named Bill Anderson, who was my mentor, who said, "I will take you under my wing if you do all my homework for me, and I will teach you how to do game design." And so that started my career as a video game designer.
Act of God, just wiping it all out.
Yeah, several moments of act of God in my career. Fun little twists of fate that have led me to where I have ended up.
Like growing up, wanting to be a game designer, game developer, were there certain games that you were drawn to? Like, what did you play?
Well, I played everything. I had a realization in like the 90s that I'm like, everything that I did as a child led towards me being a game creator very early on. I remember playing Pong, at a gym where my parents were exercising and I was waiting in the lobby for them. I remember when the Atari 2600 came out and neighbors had it. And so I'd go to their house and play it. An arcade kind of sprung up near my house when I was young. So I would steal quarters from my dad and go play as many video games as I could. I played everything, and I just was fascinated with the medium. I love the noises and the gameplay and the little characters, the worlds that they would create. I was very young into getting into Dungeons and Dragons. I think I started playing it in 78 or so, somewhere around there. So maybe about 5 years after its creation. And so I learned how to dungeon master very quickly because I was the one who owned all the books. My friends would play and I would DM. I had one summer, my parents built a house that was kind of high up in the hills. And so it was very isolated, and I couldn't drive yet. And so I spent an entire summer just making board games. I invented a type of board game that was a comic book that you essentially was a kind of like a choose your own adventure, but with a comic book. And so I made a whole bunch of those. I had a younger brother who's like 9 years younger. So I would make a lot of games for him. And they were usually based on licensed things that he liked, like G.I. Joe and Inspector Gadget and Indiana Jones and things like that. So I was constantly making games and constantly those were my hobbies, like drawing comics and making games. Where I invented a game that was a mix of a dungeon crawl and Scrabble. And actually,
there's a mashup.
Yeah, actually, I've gone back recently to look at that because I'm like, I think it could be a fun game. So these were the things that occupied my time as a child. But I was also obsessed with Disneyland. My father was a cast member of the second and third year the park was open. And so we would go every year, as he would put it, whether we needed to or not. And so I became obsessed with Disneyland and attractions and the layout of the park. And I had memorized the layout. I could literally walk it in my imagination. And then, of course, I love toys and comics and all that. So these were all things that just kind of, they made me who I was. They say that whatever you are affected by when you're like 8 or 9 years old, that's what you are for the rest of your life.
One big bowl of creative soup.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I do this exercise sometimes with other people that I call my geekyology, like a genealogy, but for geeky stuff. And so, I can very clearly trace the line. Like for me, it started with, before I could read, I remember reading a Peter Pan book. And so I fell in love with Peter Pan and pirates and the idea of a Neverland, this world that has lots of little lands within it. From Peter Pan, that led to seeing the movie Peter Pan, that led to me being interested in Disneyland, which led me interested in pirates, which led me interested in the history of pirates, which led me to whatever. Like there's this there's this very clear line, it runs through Ray Harryhausen. Yeah, it's my geekiology, you're right. It runs through Ray Harryhausen, it runs through the Haunted Mansion, it runs through Dungeons and Dragons, it runs through, all these arcade games, all these things that then, kind of build and build and build and build into all the things that I've had interest in over the years. And so it's a real fun exercise. I often will ask other people, hey, what's yours? And it's really neat to see. Knowing where you come from, I think, is a very important thing. And that's another thing that's part of my personality is I love history, partially just because I am a big believer that if you forget the history, you're doomed to repeat it or you'll make the same mistakes.
With that geekiology, I'm assuming that that helped to speak into a lot of that game development of the video games. Can you tell me about that video game journey?
Sure. So, like I said, I was an artist originally, and I made a very conscious decision to be a game designer. Like I said, I had this epiphany not too much longer after when I was working as a game designer that, all the things that I had been interested in led up to being a game designer, right? It was kind of a job I felt like I was meant to do. It's nice to be able to realize, that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing in life. So I had the opportunity to work on some pretty high-profile games almost straight off the bat. I did some work on a game called Soul Blade, which later became a series called Soul Calibur. And this was a fighting game for Namco. And I flew to Japan and worked a little bit with the team to help them come up with some ideas and things like that, and just mainly see what it was like to work in Japan, which was a very interesting and eye-opening experience for me since I hadn't really traveled before then. Got to work on a game called Pac-Man World, which was a revitalization of the Pac-Man character for his 20th anniversary, and that became a big hit. And then I was working on a few other things for Namco when I got an offer from this mentor, Bill. He had moved on to a company called Capcom. And so I went to Capcom to work on a game called Maximo, which was we called it a spiritual successor to Ghosts and Goblins. So if you know Ghosts and Goblins, the game where the little knight runs through the graveyard and when he gets hit, he loses his armor and he's in his underpants. We had a character, Maximo, who did the same thing. He would fight, skeletons and ghosts and all types of monsters. And it was a lot of fun. We did that, and then we did a sequel called Maximo versus Army of Zin, which also all these games that I ended up working on ended up being what are known as greatest hits, which meant at the time you had to sell at least 500,000 units of the game. So they were all big hits. So I have a lot of really big hits on my resume. I always say I look really good on paper. And so after Maximo, the management changed at Capcom, and so I was looking to find other people to work with. And I ended up at Sony down in Los Angeles working on a game called God of War. I did some level design for that. I did the first level of that game, and I did the bosses. I had done a lot of bosses when I was doing like Maximo and Pac-Man and all that. So that was kind of my specialty. So I did boss fights for those games. And it was around that time I was going to a show. There's a really great show in San Francisco every year called the Game Developers Conference. And I'd been attending that for several years. And I got to a point where I was with a friend of mine and I said, I don't feel like I'm really learning anything anymore. I feel like I've kind of heard it all. And I feel like I don't want to waste my employer's money, by going to this thing. What should I do? And my friend said, well, why don't you give some talks? You have a lot of knowledge and maybe you should start sharing it. So I gave a talk on boss fights, and it was actually a really big hit. Every year they would do a deck of cards that would have the speakers, like the most successful speakers' faces on them. And so I gave a talk, and then the next year I was on the deck of cards because it was a really well-received talk. So I gave this talk about boss fights, and I was like, what do I do for an encore? And so I said, well, how about I talk about two things that I love the most, which is level design and Disneyland. And so I gave a talk that you can still find online called Everything I Learned About Level Design I Learned from Disneyland. And essentially what it was comparing the tricks that you would use in video game design with the tricks that the Imagineers used to, kind of lure people around the park. And there's concepts like weenies, which are the mountains and castles and things like that would draw your eye. And they act like when you wave a weenie in front of a dog, That's where the term comes from. And so, so I gave this talk, and it was extremely well received. It was, the audience was packed, but what I didn't know was in the audience were a couple of very important people, actual Disney Imagineers that had showed up because they were like, who the hell is this guy that doesn't work for us, but is talking about Disneyland? And so they kind of came in at first with their arms kind of crossed, about what does this guy know? And then by the end of it, they were like, wow, this is really good stuff. Can you please come to Imagineering and give this talk? And that eventually led to a job offer to be an Imagineer, which I accepted. But the other important thing that happened was there was a fellow named Cory Doctorow in the audience who ran a website called Boing Boing. And he was a big Disney fan. And he wrote up a huge write-up on my talk. And it caught the eye of a friend of his, a publisher, a fellow named Chris Webb, who worked for Wiley, which was a book publisher. They're the guys that do the For Dummies books. And Chris called me up and said, hey, I heard about this really great talk that you gave. Do you think there's a book in it? And I said, yeah, I think so, but I'd have to do more than just talk about Disneyland. There's, I'd have to talk about game design. And I said, you guys make the For Dummies books. What do you want, the game design for dummies book? And Chris said these words that maybe changed my life in a very interesting direction, which was, he said, no, I want the Scott Rogers book of game design. And so that led to me writing a book called Level Up, the Guide to Great Video Game Design, which is now, it's been around for like 15 years. It's in its second edition. I'm currently working on a third, but so this year I had a big health issue. I had cancer. This is the second time I had cancer. And so as a result of it, my doctor was like, well, let's get rid of this. Let's not have you get cancer again. So I went through a bone marrow transplant. So I had kind of back-to-back these two big medical procedures. And during that time, I'm like, look, there's a lot of expenses and I have to live away from home for a while because I am immune compromised and all that. And so I did a GoFundMe. I said, hey, maybe, I could raise some money to help pay for this housing that I've got to live in away from home and all that. And the response was amazing. People like literally came out from all over the world saying, look, some of the stories were, one of them was, I'm in Italy. There's no game design program in Italy, but I bought your book and I read it, and now I'm working in games. Or another gal was like, I was in the Army. I didn't want to be in the Army anymore. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. I thought maybe games would be cool. My mom bought me a copy of your book. Now I'm making games. Again and again and again, this dozens of stories like this of people saying from around the world how my book has helped them start their career in game design. They read it when they were younger. One of the things that people say about it is that it's very accessible, and it also appeals to younger readers. And I will also say it's the best video game design book you'll ever read with a chili recipe in it.
That's a good quantifier.
Yeah, well, and the good news is with each edition, I put a new chili recipe in, so it gives you a reason to buy them all. But the way that I learned how to design games, very quickly I learned that just writing game design documents and things like that, people didn't want to read these things. They found them very boring and they would lose patience or attention or whatever. So I'm an artistic person by nature, so I started drawing cartoons to illustrate how the gameplay was meant to be played and what I wanted. And I would give these cartoons essentially to my programmers and artists to go, look, this is what I'm looking for. And they would get it because it's right there, and they would elaborate on it, make it better, things like that. I found that a very effective way to communicate my game designs. So Level Up and my other two books as well are filled with drawings that I've drawn of game design and examples and things like that. And so that's another reason I think people like it, is because it's visual and people respond really well to visuals. So I'm very proud of those books, particularly Level Up, just because I have, I've been very touched and humbled by the responses that people have told me, their stories about, how my book has helped them become game designers.
That is a going from being an expert in boss level, being a boss master. It's pretty wild. I guess every game has got to have that challenge. It's like the one thing you've got to overcome. And
Right.
so I'm curious, like, are you starting with boss levels?
It depends on the game. I mean, certain games lend themselves to boss fights, others do not. But I think that you've hit on the right idea, which is it's that challenge. It's a kind of a moment of pressure that you get used to playing the game a certain way. And then there's one part of it where an additional pressure is added to the play experience to make things more exciting and to put some threat to the player. So, for example, I'm playing this game, Balatro, Balatro, and it's pretty new. It just came out. It's essentially a deck builder with a deck of traditional playing cards. So you're trying to make full houses, pairs, and straights, and things like that. And there's a certain point value that you're trying to hit. So, like, you start at 3, try to get 300 points, and you're trying to get 500 and 800, whatever. But then after each level, there's actually bosses. There's moments where the number is a lot higher than you're used to trying to get, but there's also some sort of condition to give you pressure. So, for example, it might be you have to hit this 1,200 point threshold, but every hand you're going to discard a card. And so this boss situation comes along, and now it discards my jack, and I'm like, there goes my jack. Now I'm screwed, you know. So yeah, exactly. So a boss is something that makes the player kind of shake their fist and go, I hate you. I need to defeat you, you know. And the best bosses are ones that often will come back in the course of a game. Like we did a game many years ago that was based on the movie Demolition Man, if you remember that.
Oh yeah,
Sylvester Stallone movie. And so we had Wesley Snipes, he's the bad guy in the movie. But the plot of the movie, the characters didn't really encounter each other until like the end of the movie. But we were like, we need to have the boss in there to remind the player that you hate him and you want to defeat him. And so we had at the end of each level, Wesley Snipes would come out and like shoot at you or do something to kind of screw you over. And you would be like, Wesley Snipes, I will kill you. And so by the end of the game, you're like, all right, I'm ready to smack Wesley Snipes down because he's such a little jerk. And so that's one of the secrets about boss fights that I have is that you want to make the boss a recurring character in your game, or at least over the course of the level. Like BioShock, for example, is a really good game with great bosses that you know about the bosses and you learn about them. So by the time you're ready to fight them, all this kind of tension or fear or things have been built up. So now you're like, I got to kill this evil dentist.
You think you're about there, but then the princess is in another castle. That's what happens.
Oh yeah, but that's cruel. That's cruel game design. There's a different. That's a young game designer mistake, in my opinion. Young game designers at first, and sometimes tabletop game designers, find themselves thinking in an adversarial way, where they're like, I have to defeat the player. I have to be better than the player. And Dungeon Masters do this a lot too, the cruel ones. But really, that's not the goal. The goal for games really is to make the player feel good and win. You want to win a game. You don't want to lose a game. Now, there are some games where you go, okay, I lost it once or twice, but eventually I'm going to win it, right? I'm going to learn the strategy. I'm going to memorize the patterns or whatever the case may be. And so very early on in my career, this was the transition between Maximo and Maximo versus Army of Zin. I learned the difference between difficulty and challenging. Challenging is what you want. You want a game to be challenging and the player feels like they have to struggle and overcome and win. Where difficult is just you're grinding down on the player and saying, I'm going to crush you because I hate you. You are the player and I'm the game designer and I'm better than you. So Maximo, for example, is a difficult game. There's a lot of kind of unfair systems in it to the player. One of them was every time you would die, you had to pay a death coin to come back. But in Maximo, the price of the death coin escalated. So every time, like you pay 1 the first time, 2 the second, 3 the third. And so they got to a point where like getting 5 death coins was really hard to do. It was almost impossible. 6, I think, was impossible at that point. depending on how good you were in the game. So that was just cruel. That was just a mean thing to do to the player. Where in Army of Zin, we just said, let's just get rid of that. That's just not a good system. And so we changed how the respawn system worked. So that was a good lesson for me to learn as a creator. In the end, video games, for example, you want players to win and be happy and feel good because they will then buy your next game. Because the whole goal is really this is the horrible secret of game design is, of course, it's an industry, it's a business. And as a game designer, my job is to keep employed because I want to keep making games because I love making games, and making games is fun. And it's a great way to make a living, and it pays pretty well as well. And so my goal is to make something that people will want to play and go, oh, that's a good Scott Rogers game. I want to play the next Scott Rogers game. And so this is a dirty little secret that a lot of people don't learn because they think that making games is about art, or they think it's about expressing their own creativity, or they think it's about making a commercial product or whatever. And it is all those things, but most importantly, the goal is to make money so we can keep working.
And to make the money, you've got to give people that story where they feel like they're being rewarded and they get to be the hero at the end.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's why Dungeons and Dragons was so popular. It was the first game that really made it about the person that was playing the game, right? You think about it, all those other games that came before it, you were just, some pawn or mover or whatever. And then Dungeons and Dragons comes along and says, this is a game about you. And they're like, I like me. Me is important. I want to be the hero. And that's why I think it became such a huge hit, was that it turned the focus away from the game itself and towards the player.
Yeah, that's right. All the games that were kind of in that same sphere were more like squads of characters or armies and things like that. Yeah. That's interesting. I actually have a question about writing. Is writing an entertaining and accessible book similar to like good game design?
Personally, I find writing an extremely painful process. My favorite quote, I forget who it attributes to, but it's all you have to do to write is sit at the typewriter and bleed. That's and for me, that's what it feels like. It can be an excruciating process, but I do it for two reasons. One, because somebody's paying me to do it, but the second reason is because I have a lot of knowledge that I've learned over the years, and you can't be a dragon, hoarding your knowledge. You have to share it. And so this is, I also teach classes occasionally on game design. But really, I get to a point where I learn a lot, and then I see other people struggling with the same questions that I've experienced. And so rather than just, I'll be happily tell, an individual. I love, like I just had a Zoom call yesterday with a whole classroom of kids, and I looked at their game designs and gave them advice, and it was fantastic. It's really fun for me, but that's why I write the books, is because I can hit a broader audience. I can tell people, if they say, hey, how do I learn more about tabletop game design? I say, well, I just so happen to have written a book on the topic. That you can pick up at Amazon or your favorite, book retailer, and it's called Your Turn. And please go and buy a copy, and then don't forget to review it, because that's what really helps us authors the most, is getting those reviews, because then other people will look and go, oh, this is a good book, and people are saying nice things about it. I think I will buy it myself. It's the sad truth is, we're, at least in Western civilization, we're motivated by capitalism and profit and all that, but that doesn't mean you can't have a good time writing books and making games in the process.
I write a little bit. I have a lot of writer friends, and I agree 100%. Writing is agony. It's horrible, but I love it. And they all say the same thing. They're like, oh, I love writing. I love getting these things on paper, but the process is just hell. It's horrible.
Yeah. I literally experience physical pain when I'm writing. Yeah. It's just like my guts get all twisted up, and I'm like, and then what's even worse is I have a bad habit of self-editing as I go. So it takes me twice as long, because now I'm writing it and then I'm editing it, when really I should just write it and then go back and edit it. I'm just not a very disciplined writer.
I forget who said it, but there's no good writers, just good revisers.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, I do know some people that claim that they're like, I love writing and I just sit down and write and it just flows out of me, or the whole J.K. Rowling, what she said about Harry Potter is, she just like channeled Harry Potter existed in this other dimension or whatever. And she just channeled it, and it's like, where is that? Like, that has never happened to me.
With Your Turn, the book that just came out, maybe you can share a little bit about that. And that just came out just a couple of weeks ago on Amazon. Oh, there's a copy right there.
Okay, there it is. Yeah, beautiful.
The Guide to Great Tabletop Game Design.
Yes, and this is a caricature of me pre-cancer. So unfortunately, I've lost my big Santa Claus beard, but it's a little character of me because I was like, look, this is a book about me giving advice. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and put me in the book. So essentially, the way that I write is very much how I speak. And so I just talk to the reader. I say, look, we're going to learn about games. We give some history. We give a lot of mechanisms, and we talk about the mechanisms and how they can be used for game design. So, all the things you can do with a card, all the things you can do with dice, all the things you can do with what's worker placement all about, blah, blah, blah. But then we do, in the book, there are 6 games that you will design. And I say, look, the best way to learn how to make something is to copy. And everybody does this. Everybody copies at first because you need some sort of frame of reference. And so I say, it's okay to copy as long as you don't stop there. You have to keep going and make it your own. And so we start with actually original. I came up with, because I'm insane, not only did I write a book and I did all the pictures in it, but I also invented 6 original games for the book. Because I'm just nuts. So there's these 6 original games that I designed, and then you use those as starting points. They're not the world's greatest games. They're just, I could say they're fun enough, And so then the goal is that you change elements of it, like you change a number, or you change an objective, or you change a role. This is based on, there's a book called The Game Designer's Workshop by Tracy Fullerton and Chris Swain. And I taught for several years using kind of their methods of educating. And I think it's a good foundation. And so I have adapted that, essentially that methodology. People are going to learn about how to make a game, and then they're going to revise and make. So by the end of it, they have their own original game. And that's the thing I'm the most excited about, is to start seeing people making their own games based on kind of the seeds that I've planted in the books.
With making a good game, I'm curious a little bit on your thoughts around like the hook. Like, what is it that you think really draws people in initially and keeps them attached to the game? In
video game world, there's something called unique selling points, which are essentially the things on the back of the box. So when I'm trying to come up with a hook for a game, I think of it in terms of that. I go, all right, I need like 3 to 5 of these things that sound exciting or interesting or unique or different or bizarre in some cases, that will lure the player, get them excited. So for example, my most recent published game is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game based on the movie.
The game.
And the game, exactly. Board game based on the,
nice
the 73 horror movie. And so in it, one of the hooks is there's this bag, and I call it the hideous straw bag. And it looks like all stitched up skin, and it's really gross. And it's got red lining inside to kind of simulate blood or whatever. And the game is that you're reaching inside the bag and pulling out tokens. You're putting them in first. You're looking at them going, oh crap, here's a Leatherface token. I don't like that. And that goes in the bag. And so now you know something bad is in the bag. Or maybe here's an action token that I want to enable my character to do some actions. That goes in the bag. Okay, good. We're getting action tokens in there. So then hopefully when we draw stuff out, we're getting more good stuff than bad. So a bit like, if you know, there's a game called The Quacks of Quedlinburg.
Yeah.
One of my inspirations for that. So the goal was to make this bag that people were kind of scared to draw out of, because this is a Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's not a happy, friendly game. It's a game about fear. And if you watch that movie, there's a general creep factor about the whole thing. And so I was thinking about it and going, okay, you can make art look creepy and gross, but that only lasts so long. Like it wears off. You get kind of numb to it. And so I was like, what can I do gameplay wise that would make the player kind of creeped out? And I was like, reaching into the bag was the thing, right? If you have this kind of gross bag and you're reaching into the gross bag every turn, it's a bit like grade schools used to do haunted houses. And one of the things they would do was they're like, here's a box, and you reach into it and it's full of spaghetti. And you're like, this is
the monster grapes, brain. The eyeballs.
Yeah, these are, the peeled grapes are the eyeballs. The feathers are the bat wings, that kind of thing. And so that was one of my inspirations, was this notion of these kind of creepy, reach your hand and, oh God, what am I going to get? Now, the irony is this, I designed it too well because some players reported back, they're like, well, we figured out that because you're reaching in, there's bad things in there. If you only reach in and pull out one token, you've satisfied the condition of the gameplay, which is that you pull out one token out of the bag. Otherwise, Leatherface comes after you if you decide not to do this. And so they were like, haha, we've broken the game. The game is broken, blah, blah. But it's not. What it is those guys were not playing the game right. They're not playing it in the spirit of the game. The spirit of the game is it's a push your luck game. You have to keep drawing and drawing and drawing, and hopefully you're getting more good things than bad. And so they thought that they were being clever and breaking the game, but in reality, they're just not playing it right. And so I kind of made this game a little too well because they were scared to pull out more tokens. I made it too frightening for them to do this. So this certain class of player was too scared because they didn't want to get bad things. And I get it, people in general are what I call pain avoidant. They don't like bad things to happen to them. I'm here to tell you that those people are playing the game wrong, and they shouldn't do that. Because the game is meant to be a scary, fun game, and you'll get the maximum enjoyment out of it if you play it the way that the rules say you should play it.
It can be a little bit spooky. you got to sign up for the whole story for sure when you're.
Yeah, you got to buy into the what they call the magic circle, right? The Bazinga magic circle, which is that when you enter the magic circle of gaming or any experience, you are playing by the rules of what the magic circle is. Like Disneyland has a magic circle, a literal magic circle, right? It's the train tracks that go around that encompass all of Disneyland. And so once you enter that magic circle, by going through the tunnels that lead you into, I'm talking about Anaheim, Disneyland, you have now agreed that you are in this world of fantasy and you're going to abide by those rules. And those rules mostly are things like don't, be a jerk and don't litter and don't tug on the tail of the big bad wolf character. And mostly it's to ride things and watch things and then buy things, right? That's the agreement that you're making when you go to Disneyland. In board games, the agreement is that you're not going to cheat, you're not going to be a bad player and flip the table, go on your cell phone when you're playing, those kind of things, right? It's an agreement between the game and the player, right? You're going to abide by the rules. So if you're going to play a scary game, you want to be in the spirit of that scary game. If you're going to play a game where it's a little more cutthroat, then you're going to agree to, try to outdo the other players, things like that. And it's fine. There's certain behaviors, like Cards Against Humanity has a magic circle that says you can be outrageous and say things that might shock people, put together some sort of word that is offensive, because that's all part of the magic circle of playing that game.
I think one of the beauties of that game is it makes everybody feel creative. The content was put on the cards there for them. And suddenly everybody gets to be the class clown.
Right. Yeah.
Gets to put that together and have something really funny, a really good quip to share with everybody else, and everybody laughs. I guess that much variety allows for the replayability as well. With games, there's sort of like we played that once, I'm good. Right. We bought it on the box art and played it. It was a fun story one time, but it's like I want I think of like the movie The Princess Bride. I've watched that I don't know how many 100 times. Like that's replayable for me because it gives me everything I need from, giants and rodents of unusual sides, true love. It keeps you going. What do you see in a game that gives people that replayability?
First of all, it depends on the type of game. In the old days, it used to be things like score, or status. I get my name on a leaderboard or something like that, right? That was how you got people to replay games, or even difficulty. Donkey Kong or one of those games where they were tough. Those are hard games, and so you would constantly feed in quarters because you wanted to see more of the game or get a higher score, or even Dragon's Lair, if you remember that old Laserdisc game. You wanted to finish the story and see what happened, right? So those are the old methods. The newer methods, though, those things are still somewhat valid, but they feel a little old-fashioned now. More modern things now are narrative. So, for example, my daughter is playing Baldur's Gate 3, and every day I get a report from her about what's going on with their character and what they're fighting and whatnot. Those games are, it's easy in a video game to do modular content because you have a way to shuffle them around that the player doesn't see. Right? They obfuscate the randomness. They call it procedurally generated, or games like roguelike type games are built on. One of the things that makes a roguelike is that it has procedurally generated content. And then there's adventure games that might have different stories, story threads. Think of like the Resident Evil games that had 6 or 8 different endings. But usually it was weird because those mechanisms were often not shown to the player during gameplay. They were often found by players outside of the game. So you might read a magazine that says, oh, Resident Evil has 8 different endings. And you're like, oh, I want to see all 8 different endings. So I'm going to read this magazine. It's going to help tell me how to figure out how to get these different endings. So that's another method, of course, is by just giving the player the option to see different content and things like that. But with board games, for example, the player always expects a different experience every time they play it, which is a fun and frustrating aspect of board game design, because otherwise it's a puzzle. And often people will say that a game is what they call solvable, right? That's a bad thing to have a solvable game, because that means then there's really only one way to win it, and you then are playing on rails. And if the player feels like they have no choice during the game, then it's not fun. The best thing as a game designer you can give to a player is choice. So when I'm designing a game, I want to make sure that the player has a lot of choices, that they have a lot of choices on their turn. So that way they're making different decisions each time. They have different objectives that they can. So in Texas Chainsaw, you can add a deck of objectives to challenge yourself. So that way, not in addition to just getting the hell out of there, which is the goal of the game, you can complicate things by, now I have to solve these objectives before I leave. And that's up to the player, right? I'm giving the player the choice to do this complicated type of situation rather than the normal one. And that is that way it gives the player, they're making the choice to complicate the game, but I'm giving them the option to do so. And the same is true for a few other games that I've designed, like the Alien Fate of the Nostromo game has a little Ash character, the evil android. He goes around and kind of makes your life miserable, but it's an optional character you can add to the game. So these are methods that just giving diversity and making sure that the player has options. It really is the best way, in my opinion, to help the player, facilitate the player having variety and choice in their games.
Yeah, it's tricky. I know you've got a very deep well of the video game, and when you can put all that behind the curtain in code, having like that replayability or the options or the story, it really is a lot easier to hide that.
Absolutely.
When you've got a $20 game that comes with 2 decks of cards, it takes a little bit more intentionality and creativity to do that with more limited resources for the player.
Yeah, usually it's providing a surplus of things. Like, for example, you could have a card game that has a deck of 30 cards, and then you could say, take 9 of those cards out, leave them out of the game, and now you have this you don't know what those cards are, right? They're meant to be face down and you don't look at them. And so now you're like, all right, well, what cards are left, right? And so even if you've memorized the deck of cards, you now have this little bit of a obfuscation factor where you're helping create this situation to make it a different experience each time, right? That's why you do that, is to make it a different experience. And it's not going to change things too much, depending on the game, of course. But in a simple game like, let's say you're playing Uno and you leave out some certain cards, that's going to change the experience than if you're playing with all the cards.
A little bit of the scarcity model. If we could go back a little bit, I know, you've compared your experiences at Disney with game design, and there's all these correlations. And that's one of those things that, even me personally, I was like, that's a job that I could do and would love to do, is be an Imagineer. I was like, that would be a blast. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience? Like, what did day-to-day look like? What were some of the standouts?
Well, I jokingly say it was the best and worst job I ever had. It was super high pressure, and there was a lot of, politics and things like that. But I also got to, thanks to the projects that I was working on, I literally got to climb to the top of the Matterhorn and go to the basement of the Haunted Mansion. One of the projects that I was working on eventually became an app that you could actually use in the park called Disney Play. It had a different name when I was working on it. But part of the job that we were doing was we had to install Bluetooth recognizers within all of the attractions. And so because we were using a phone as a medium to communicate the gameplay. And so we had to have these Bluetooth receivers that allowed the players to, recognize that, hey, I know you're in the Pirates of the Caribbean, or I know you're in this part of Fantasyland or something like that. So I got to crawl all over the place, and I'm not a hardware guy, but I would help supervise, where we wanted to put hardware, and I would go around and kind of go, okay, this is the best place. And, that way we had kind of a continuous signal through a ride or something like that. And it was amazing. It was, as a Disney fan, particularly a fan of the park, I'm mostly a Disneyland fan. I like Disney. I'm okay with the movies and other things, but I adore the theme park just because it's this incredibly constructed thing. And at first, I was very intimidated when I got my job as an Imagineer. I was like, oh my God, I'm a game designer, and now I'm an Imagineer. And even though I talked about game design in Disneyland, I was like, now I've got to put my money where my mouth is, and so there's a lot of pressure. But I had this moment of epiphany. One day I was in the Haunted Mansion, and there's this illusion where its statue had busts, and when you kind of move side to side, it looks like they're following you, right? The eyes are following you, and that's because the illusion, I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil this for people, but it's essentially a reverse mold of a head. And because the nature of the optical illusion, it looks like it's actually 3D. I had known about this. I knew how this effect worked, so it was not a mystery to me. But I went around the back to the wall where these things were mounted. And so one of the things that I would do in my childhood and actually through adulthood is I would make haunted houses in my garage every Halloween. And so I would make effects. And the Haunted Mansion is always, for a lot of haunted, people who make haunted houses, the Haunted Mansion is their goal. And so they will often try to replicate the effects and things that are in the Haunted Mansion. So I tried to do some of these effects myself as a kid. And I was 8 years old, and we were doing the projection of the singing bust and things like that. It was pretty wild. But anyway, I go around the back of this wall, and I see this piece of plastic with this reverse mold sculpture in it. And it's literally just held into a wall with 4 nails. And I'm like, I've done that. Like, I've done that in my own garage, and I had this epiphany, which was the only difference between Disneyland and myself was that Disneyland had a better budget and a permanent place to do these things. And then I had this realization that, people made these things, and therefore I could do it. If they could do it, I could do it. And it really changed my attitude towards being creative. I kind of got like a can-do attitude, and I ended up doing all types of crazy things that I never thought I would do in my lifetime. I had kind of these, essentially it was the ghosts of the former Imagineers kind of like, they're inspiring me because they could do it. And a lot of them didn't know what the hell they were doing. They were just making it up as they went along, just like I was. So I found that really inspiring as an Imagineer, and it helped get me through some tough times because I had these other Imagineers as kind of my guiding stars to follow.
I love that the Disney theme park is just like a giant garage that has a lot of budget.
I mean, it's just a permanent carnival, right? That's really what it is.
Well, that's inspiring. I love that epiphany you had of thinking that there's really nothing you can't do. Like if you can imagine it, other people were doing the same thing. I know there's a lot of different jobs and a lot of different ideas that we just kind of put these false pressures on us, and we think, oh, there's no way I could create that. No way. Like, why would I even paint? A painting. I'm looking at all these other masters that are doing it so well. Like, it's nice that you were able to capture that
can-do attitude, but also the just go do it. I always say, just like Nike says, just do it. When I talk to game designers, particularly young game designers who are kind of filled with doubts and worries and, can I be a game designer and all that? I just say, I say writers write, musicians play music, game designers make games. So if you want to be a game designer, just go make a game. It's not that hard. It's, even if it's something like, a classic race type board game where you have a start, you have a series of squares, and you have a finish.
It's Candyland.
It's Candy. I mean, that's Candyland, right? And the basis of literally hundreds of other games, right? And so if you can just make that and then put it in front of people, because the other thing I firmly believe in is games are a craft. They're not. I mean, people often try to say, "Oh, well, games are art," and they'll try to defend it. And I often feel like the people that really sternly defend games as art, they're kind of compensating. They feel like they have like a inferiority complex because they want games to be held up in the same sphere as theater and movies and books and these other, works of art. But games just need to be games. They don't need to be art. What they need to do is they need to be something that is playable and fun for another person. And in my opinion, that makes it a craft. Just in the same way a chair, you can have a really pretty chair, but it's not really, it's not doing what a chair needs to do until you can sit in it. And so, that's the other thing that I often am thinking about is how do people use this thing, because it's a thing meant to be used. And the using is playing this game, following the rules, having fun, existing in the magic circle. There's a lot of other weight and things that come into it. But ultimately, it's this thing that is meant to be used by another person and hopefully bring enjoyment. I mean, sometimes you don't. There are games that have been designed that are not meant to be enjoyable. That's serious games. You mostly find those in video games. There's this whole classification called serious games. And those are fine too, because their intention is to then make you think or maybe a call to action or something like that. And if it does that, then it's successful.
Well, Scott, I feel like we could go on for about 2-3 years of just diving into the deep hole of game design, game theory, imagination, Imagineering. You are a deep well of
fantastic insight.
Yeah, it's great. I love that you've been able to compartmentalize and share this in bits that all of us get to chew on, and love running into a kindred spirit. One thing we like to do here before we go is we've got our
hidden roll die.
That's right. Roll that die. Let's see what comes up.
Going to ask you some rapid fire questions.
Some random questions here, and we'll see. Since you can't roll,
I'll be rolling for you.
Okay. I'll use my virtual Pop-O-Matic.
All right. Can you give us a roll there, Scott?
Here we go. First roll.
The Broken Heart. All right. Name a game you're likely to avoid even if everybody else is playing it.
Right. So I am by nature, I'm what I call an omni gamer. I play everything. I'm an omnivore when it comes to games. I want to play everything. But my philosophy with games is I will play anything once. I will play it twice to make sure I understand it, and I will play it a third time to verify that I hate it. And the game that I played 3 times that I know that I'll never play again is a game called Tokaido, which is a game about essentially you're a tourist in Japan, like feudal Japan, and you are kind of inching your way down this line of different towns or whatever, gathering experiences in that. Now, it's a very clever game, and it's a pretty game, and there's a lot of things I admire about it, but I hate playing it because I always
Not for you.
I always lose. I always end up getting screwed over, not getting the things that I want to get. I had 3 bad experiences playing the game, and I said, you know what? I don't ever need to play this again because every time I've played it, I've not enjoyed it. So that is my broken heart game.
You're on your trip, taking pictures. You get mugged. Who knew?
Oh, you don't even get mugged. It's not even that interesting. Getting mugged would at least add some interest to it.
All right, let's roll again.
Second one.
Pop-O-Matic that thing. The lightning bolt. All right, lightning bolt. What is an emerging game trend that you believe needs more titles? What types of games need more?
Well, I mean, like certain genres have already exploded. Like I love worker placement, but that's already, there's a ton, more and more of those. I want to see games that tell a story, maybe even a story over a couple of game sessions, but are short. So for example, I adore the legacy game format, the format created by Rob Davio in games like Rift's Legacy, and then later Pandemic Legacy, and now there's a Ticket to Ride Legacy, things like that. So I love that concept of continuity in games, right? You start with one type of game and the game evolves and you add rules and you add components and things like that to the game. But my biggest complaint about that genre is it takes too many games. Like it normally takes about 12 to 16 games to play to experience the full package that comes in the game. And I think that's too long. I think that players don't have the patience. They don't, particularly now, getting people together to play games, is still difficult, even though we're coming out of the lockdown and that kind of thing. So I would love to see like the legacy game, but in a shorter format, because I still love the genre. I think it's really cool. It adds so many neat ideas. I mean, I even love ripping up components. Seeing an experienced gamer rip something up and the agony on their faces, to me, it's hilarious. So I love that genre. I'd love to see more of it, but I don't want to. I want it to be in a more digestible format.
That's a good, deep game developer answer.
I love Gloomhaven, but it is agony to me to put on the sticker. And even though you can take the sticker off, it's like that's torment.
Right. I love that though. I whenever I play those types of games with my friends, I'm always taking pictures of them. I take this off, rip this up. Whatever. They're like, no, I can't rip up a game. I've been conditioned to treat games nicely, and I'm like, break that conditioning.
All right, let's roll again.
Third one.
Crossbones.
Ooh, actually, I have a question for this one.
Go for it.
What is your hidden treasure tabletop game? Your favorite?
Oh, well, I mean, I literally just published a whole list of these of 20 games on my Facebook and LinkedIn page. And I think even X is, formerly Twitter. So I have a list of 20 games that I could easily pull from, but it feels like a bit of a cheat. My go-to answer is a game called Unearth, which is a dice game, and it has cards, but it's essentially a game where you're little archaeologists. The theme almost doesn't matter at all. That's the only bummer about it, is that even though it has some theme and the artwork is gorgeous, it looks like, if you know the game Monument Valley, the app, it looks like a lot like that. But the game is you have these different polyhedral dice, and you roll them, and then you assign them in an attempt to kind of capture these archaeological sites. And for my money, it's maybe one of the best uses of polyhedral dice outside of Dungeons and Dragons. Because the decision space of like which dice do I use, and then when you roll it and commit it, now it's out. You don't get to use it, and you're still playing, trying to capture other things, and so you have to be very strategic about what you capture. But then other people can steal it from you, and there's a whole kind of priority system on who gets to capture things at a certain point. But it's a game that not a lot of people know about. To me, it's just a very clever design. I kind of marvel, sometimes as a game creator, you guys know, you look at something and you go, oh, I wish I had created that, and so that's one of those games that I have that feeling about. Unearth. It's by, I want to say it's by Brother Wise Games. Is the publisher.
We'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, this has been, as I said earlier, a deep well of creativity. I'm happy to see you on the mend, and the world needs more of what you've got. And so thank you so much for taking the time, for diving into, I guess, your journey through play.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure. It was a pleasure meeting both of you, and I hope we keep in touch. And I love talking to people about games. It's my favorite thing to do.
We can tell. Well, thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you very much. Have a good one, guys.
This has been Hidden Roll, the brains behind your favorite toys, games, and all things play. If you enjoyed this episode, the best way that you can support us is to subscribe to our YouTube channel and tell your favorite brains to subscribe as well. Hit the bell, thumbs up, leave a comment, and follow Hidden Roll Podcast on Instagram as well. If you know of someone who would be a great fit to be on our podcast, or if you'd like to learn the story behind any toy or game, leave a comment below, or send us a message at hiddenrollpodcast.com/suggestions. That's hidden, ROLE, podcast.com. Once again, special thanks to Pop, People of Play, the one-stop hub for all toy and game inventors. Visit www.peopleofplay.com to learn more. This podcast is also made possible by the continued support of the brains who never grew up, inventors of play, Streamline Design.